Early in the morning, everything was incredibly quiet at the research center. A few barely visible dots of light darted around the corridor. They silently moved past several researchers who had worked through the night and stopped in a corner where snores could be heard. In the dimly lit office, a man was sitting at a desk, half-heartedly browsing a file in his hand. Much of his face was covered in shadow. Faint rays of the morning sun landed on the pictures attached to the file, along with lines of inconspicuous words describing the life of some girl from childhood to present. Significant progress had been made in locating the Queen. In the dark lobby, a scatter of people were seated, each looking at a copy of the same file in their hand. Some of them showed contempt on their faces, and others wore a frown. All of them were engaged in a heated debate, except for this expressionless man who showed little concern with the file in front of him.
Even if it's just a possibility, it's still worth a try.
A cold voice cut in, bringing the debate to an abrupt halt.
The company her father left behind will make good bait,
someone next to him said with a laugh.
So the high and mighty Ares is willing to get his hands dirty for an insignificant little girl, huh?
The sarcasm and scorn in his tone were unmistakable.
The experiment is getting nowhere because of technological limitations. No need to be desperate about it. Caution is a virtue, but too much of it becomes cowardice.
He stood up and walked over to Ares, then bent over and added,
Wouldn't you agree, Ares?
The man at the receiving end of the mockery slowly blinked, then raised his lips and got up.
There's another saying.
He took the report from the desk and placed it in the other man's hand, then gently tapped it with his fingertip.
Those who don't tread carefully are more likely to fall.
He slowed down and squinted his eyes.
They find it difficult to get back on their feet. I hope we'll meet again.
Rays from the rising sun streamed in through the shutters and illuminated his figure. The name on the file stood in vivid contrast with the black and white environment, as if it had been written that way on purpose. There was a warmth churning in his chest. It passed through his veins to reach his fingertips before merging with the name. For a brief moment he felt at a loss, and his well-proportioned eyebrows crinkled a little. The thought that the experiment was approaching the make-or-break point made him at once anxious and excited. Lucien repeated the word excited over and over in his head. He didn't know why, but he sort of welcomed this kind of excitement which he hadn't experienced for years. Lucien arched his lips in a smile.
I hope you won't let me down.
7 hours before the two met.
Oh, please make me proud, Mouse number 9.
A young researcher pounded his left shoulder over and over again, then stretched his neck and cried in a pleading tone.
Come on, number 9.
The woman next to him rolled her eyes in annoyance and said,
Will you please stop talking to your mice in the middle of the night? It creeps me out. Ugh. Besides, you will annoy those poor things to death, and then you will have to get a new litter.
Come on, give me a break. This is my 4th litter. I have to give them all the moral support I can muster so that they can do well in the experiment. Then I'll finally get praised by Professor Lucien. Morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Oh, good morning, Professor Lucien. The report from yesterday's 4 controlled experiments is ready.
Thanks. You can leave it in my office.
Lucien walked into the lab.
Professor, all the frozen sections of mouse brain from last week have been processed and archived as per your instructions. Here's the summary document.
Thank you. Great job.
Professor, the observation data and experiment materials we requested from the hospital arrived this morning. Once confirmed, we'll have them uploaded before 4 p.m.
To ensure the integrity of the materials, get the rest of the team to double-check the data when the upload is done.
This was Lucien's typical morning at the research center. It was also how most researchers started their workday, or how some of them ended a whole night's work. As usual, Lucien was doing observation in the lab with his assistants. A number of controlled experiments on how frozen mouse brain sections evolved over time had ended today, and a few teams of researchers had raised relevant questions. After confirming these questions, Lucien and some team members set about analyzing the experimental data in order to set a framework for the next set of experiments. Everything went exceptionally well today, with very few flaws found in the experiments, and with the discovery of new data that was worth analyzing and verifying.
Thank you for your hard work, everyone.
After going over the final report, he gave a quick lecture about the things to watch for in future experiments, and then left the lab with his assistant.
You seem to be in a good mood today.
The assistant, who was half a step behind Lucien and carrying a big stack of files in his arms, pursed his lips and craned his neck before asking inquisitively. Taken aback by the comment, Lucien fixed his gaze on the files for a few seconds before slowly blinking his eyes.
What makes you say that?
To be honest, I don't know.
Surprised that Lucien would reply to his casual comment, the assistant tilted his head thoughtfully and said,
Just a feeling. You have an easy aura about you today, and you speak more softly than usual.
Do I usually look stern?
Lucien said with a smile and thrust his hands into his pockets.
No, of course not. You've always been easygoing, but today you look as if something good has happened to you.
The assistant scratched his head in embarrassment and added,
Sorry, that was a weird thing to say. What I'm trying to say is that if something good did happen, we'd love to celebrate with you.
Without replying, Lucien gave an easy smile and slightly quickened his steps. The distance between him and his assistant resumed.
Maybe something good is going to happen,
he said softly. It'd be only 3 hours before they met. Miracle Finder. Little could be found on the internet about this show filmed more than a decade ago, except for some bad quality clips and a few uninspiring interviews and not-so-funny punchlines, all of which would be sleep-inducing to watch. Lucien played the latest episode, and with an expressionless face, tapped the keyboard to fast-forward. A show out of step with the times would end up being abandoned by the audience. The show playing on the screen had become the background of the lab. The materials about the show in Lucien's hands seemed irrelevant and unnecessary, but he still unhurriedly flipped through them until he was interrupted by a phone call.
Ares, it's me. I talked to her. She should be coming for you soon. You still remember our deal, right? Well, I'm not saying that...
That'll be all.
He hung up the phone abruptly, then put it aside after glimpsing the number on its screen. On the monitor, another guest left the show, making the whole thing look like a poorly conceived shadow play. Lucien rhythmically rapped the desk with his knuckle, the sound of which mingled with the fast-spoken lines to give the place an eerie coldness. He redirected his gaze to the materials, only this time he was not reading the content. If he was going to use this show as bait, some preparation would be necessary. What should he say? Should he point out the problems with the show, or open by introducing himself? Lucien carefully weighed his options, as if the world's survival depended on it. The lunch break came, and intermittent chatter from the corridor seeped into the office.
What am I going to do?
Said an anxious male voice, as if desperate to get an answer from his friend. The person next to him yawned and replied indifferently.
What's the big deal? This'll be the first time we meet. I'm a little nervous. What opening line should I use? Hello. Good evening. Oh, come on, don't leave me hanging. Teach me a few tricks.
Is it really that important?
Of course it is. The first impression makes all the difference. So I gotta come up with a good opening line. Hey, are you listening?
The knuckle rapping the desk suddenly stopped. As the two walked on, the sound of their conversation grew dimmer until it was drowned out by the din of the environment. Casual words can be easily misconstrued. Lucien slightly tilted his head and closed his palms, then picked up the coffee next to him that had long gone cold. After a moment's thought, he took the materials along with the girl's profile and locked them in the cabinet. Anyway, she must be more nervous than I am, Lucien reasoned as he straightened his back. The two would meet in less than an hour. Lucien closed his eyes and heard the spatters of rain coming from outside the window. The fierce sunlight pierced through his eyelids, forcing him to open his eyes in displeasure. Vexed by the unexpected sun shower, Lucien got up and made his way into the lab. The lunch break at the research center was not over yet. The whole lab was deadly silent, except for the soft whirring of machinery. After getting himself disinfected, Lucien put on a white coat and with deft movements took from the freezer a large box of flasks. Instead of being neatly arranged as they were supposed to, these flasks were scattered in the box willy-nilly. Perhaps it was the doing of some inexperienced intern, or perhaps someone was in a hurry to wrap up their work. Lucien looked around, his face showing not a hint of emotion. Moments later, he carefully took out the flasks and arranged them on the table. They were more numerous than expected and took up the entire table surface. After that, he patiently classified the flasks based on how long they had been in the freezer and rearranged them accordingly. His movements were slow but incredibly precise. In no time at all, the flasks had been placed where they belonged. When the sorting was done, Lucien sat down at the table and took out a large pile of well-organized reports. He flipped each to the middle and set it down beside him. And then, in the order as indicated in these reports, he placed the sorted frozen sections one by one under the microscope and almost immediately started noting down what he observed on a piece of paper. Not many people could endure the lonely hours in the lab. After all, it's in human nature to desire quick results. But the charm of time lies in the fact that everything takes time to get done. This is especially true if you're taking the road less traveled. And he happened to be a very patient hunter. Lucien's movements were very slow. He seemed to enjoy this process of proving his hypothesis, and he found it rewarding. There were a lot of frozen sections, but he didn't take long to finish recording all the data, for he was spared the trouble of comparing them. He patiently put the flask back one by one in the freezer, then returned to the table, took the piece of paper where he had recorded the experimental data, and put it among the finished reports. Without catching a break, he got up and walked up to another table, took another sheet of paper, and started observing the mice. The brain cells that were supposed to be inertial showed a high level of activity. The mice that were supposed to be active were languishing. He glanced at a normally behaving mouse inside the glass container and recorded what he saw. Lucien checked a few more glass containers, each of them clearly labeled. In this experiment project, every team was doing their part and strictly following the schedule. There was nothing more to be done around this spacious lab. Lucien surveyed the lab, and with a pretended casualness, looked down to check his watch. Only 55 minutes had passed. He took the file folder and tapped it on his shoulder, incredulous about how slowly time had passed. The two would meet in 5 minutes. Lucien took off his disinfectant-smelling coat and put on one of his regular white robes. He thought for a moment, and instead of heading straight out, he leaned against the door. The call was an hour ago. It's reasonable to assume that he will make another attempt to secure the investment, which means she will pay another visit to LFG. So, time-wise, Lucien did some math in his head and decided that the girl would turn up any minute now. Movie making, TV producing, her father's programs. This is pretty much everything they'd be talking about. With his arms crossed, Lucien imagined what the girl would say and rehearsed his reply. This name appeared before him again. In the empty lab, Lucien stood with his eyes widened, struck by the realization that this girl, who he had never met, had been on his mind the whole day. If this girl was confirmed to be who he thought she was, her existence would have a substantial impact on how things proceed. Lucien thought to himself, trying to rationalize his strange behavior. Regardless which side she's on, as soon as the curtain rises, she will be led down a preset path by an intricate network of interests, and all he needs to do is to stay one step ahead. That said, he should avoid getting too involved with the girl. The ending has already been decided. She will not have any bearing on how the evolution will proceed. Just then, there were faint footsteps stopping outside the lab. Lucien looked down at his watch and thought it must be his colleagues coming back from their lunch break. He should get back to his office and prepare. He thought and straightened his back. The giant experimental apparatus emitted faint whirs. Piles of data stood testament to the hard work of everyone in the lab. Every experiment they conducted and recorded brought them one step closer to the ultimate truth about life. In life, as in an experiment, if you control the constants as well as the only variable, you will get the results you anticipated, if not the exact results you want.
And the only variable is you.
Lucien quickly regained calm, and everything around him looked brighter. The dark monitor on the experimental apparatus showed the reflection of his smiling eyes and arched eyebrows, which somehow combined to create an impression of cold indifference. It was the mask he was born with, one that shielded him from everyone and everything, be they good or bad. He turned around and turned the doorknob. Rays of colorful light, which he hadn't seen for ages, burst into his black and white world. The rays were faint and few, but lit up his heart like a fierce sun. After Lucien quickly freshened up, the colorful light remained visible in his eyes. He smiled. Fate had brought him a beautiful gift, though it was anybody's guess whether the gift itself was aware of its own beauty. And yet, perhaps, even fate had no idea of this gift's true value. As for the price for receiving the gift, the smile faded from Lucien's face as he wondered what kind of surprise this girl would bring. Color rained down in his black and white world. Perhaps not just color, but something else too. The girl's soft voice reached his ears. It was 10 seconds into their first encounter.